Thank you so much for SANS for having me here. It's really exciting to be here, and thank you, all of you, for coming. My name's Ian Coldwater. This talk is called Ship of Fools, and it's about Kubernetes security, both how to break it and how to secure it from people who break it. Just to kind of feel the room, how many people here feel like they have good familiarity with containers in general? Okay. How many people feel like they don't have a lot of familiarity with containers? It's okay to say yes. No shaming here. Okay. Who here feels like they have good familiarity with Kubernetes? Okay. Who feels like they don't have good familiarity with Kubernetes? Cool. All right. That is common. Okay, cool. So yeah, my name's Ian, and I do, for another week, DevSecOps at Jam Software, where I focus on container security and hardening cloud infrastructure. As of November 5th, I'm going to be working for Red Team Security, doing Red Team work, which I'm really excited about. I've been hacking since I was a kid, and I travel around the country playing capture the flag games, which are like competitive hacking games. The flags aren't physical. You have to go into the server and get them. This stuff's fun for me. And besides it being fun, I think it's really important. I think it's really important for a few reasons. One, our users depend on us. They depend on us to keep their safety in our hands. They depend on us to do right by them. And part of that is securing our infrastructure and the stuff that they're using. I also think it's important because, on a personal level, I think that having a history as an attacker and coming from that background has taught me a different way to think. And that way to think has made me a better defender. Because, normally developers are good people who assume good intent. They make features with a certain user in mind. Those personas are often good people who use the features that they've made in the ways in which they've intended. And that's great. Assuming good intent is a good practice, often a good personal quality. But here's the thing, is that not all users have good intent. Some users are bad users, and they're not going to use things in the way that you would necessarily want them to if you're a developer. And attackers have user stories too. As an attacker, I'm here to tell you some. As an attacker, I want to pwn you. So before we get into how to hack this thing, let's set the stage a little bit. In the beginning, before there were containers, there were virtual machines. And virtual machines were very useful because before, if people wanted to run different operating systems or different things like that, they would have to literally, get the rack and stack. It would take up a lot of space. It would be very expensive. It would be very annoying to do. Virtual machines cut down a lot of that overhead and allowed people to do that without getting more physical hardware. And that's cool. But virtual machines came with overhead of their own. They have a lot of resource needs. You need to set up the entire OS and everything when you don't necessarily need to do anything that heavyweight for what you're trying to run. So to solve some of those problems, people made containers. Containers are not in fact boxes, and they are not in fact filled with kittens, although perhaps they should be. A container is not a thing. Often we see the graph, I think we've seen it a few times in the last couple of days, where you have your neatly stacked boxes, you have your OS, and you have your neatly stacked containers kind of on top of them, maybe in 3 or 4. And that's a very nice looking graphic, but it's not actually how they work. A container is not a thing. It is it's a process on sharing a kernel with its host. Containers are made of C groups and isolated by namespaces, and are basically sort of a lot of Linux things kind of stapled together. And so if you think of a container as being a single process, on the one hand, that saves a lot of resources compared to something like a VM. On the other hand, it can lead to interesting things, such as a shared kernel also can mean a shared kernel attack surface. And containers came with their own set of problems. For one thing, they are difficult to scale in an automated way on their own. For another thing, they're stateless, which on the one hand is great, and on the other hand can mean that it can be really hard to run certain kinds of applications if you need things to talk to one another consistently. So in order to solve some of these problems, particularly of scalability and how to deploy them, people created Kubernetes. Kubernetes, which describes itself with this mouthful of a sentence on their website, is a framework for orchestrating containers. It allows you to automate deployment, scaling up, scaling down, managing containerized applications. It's very useful for things like microservice architectures. It is very useful for being able to really do things at pretty serious scale that people weren't able to easily do with containers before. It's really useful. And it's been really good for people. People like it a lot. But Kubernetes comes with some problems of its own. It's really complex. It's really sprawling. There's a lot of moving parts. And that has sort of created a kind of situation in which, well, okay, Kubernetes has been not around that long. It started in 2014 as a Google project. Eventually, they open sourced it. It is an open source project. They gave it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation to maintain. Kubernetes is huge. It is the second largest project on GitHub after the Linux kernel, which is not technically on GitHub. It's got a very active, very large community of contributors. And they're pushing changes really fast. So we've got rapid change. We've got rapid adoption. We've got a lot of complexity. And that's cool. That's all really exciting. It's really caught on. People really like it a lot. And at first, I think they weren't necessarily expecting that it would catch on that much. It wasn't necessarily made for things like running in production. And because of that, at first, security really was not a thing that people were thinking about as much in terms of the project. So in the beginning, everything was admin. Everything was open. And security features have really improved a lot in the last several releases, like a lot. But there's still a lot of older Kubernetes versions floating around in the wild. And those versions really are very easy to attack. They left a lot wide open by default. You can still find them. And the defaults on them still, to this day, aren't necessarily going to be secure, although you can put security on them now. Also, defaults can vary really widely across cloud providers, AWS, AKS, and all of the different cloud providers have different defaults available to them. All of the different installers have different things available to them. Kubernetes has, you can roll your own. You can use commercial things like Tectonic or OpenShift. There's a lot of different ways that you can set it up. All of those are slightly different. And even within those, all of those are slightly different, because depending on your use case, you're going to want to be using different kinds of plugins and constellations of things that you're trying to do with it. All of those are going to have different defaults too, some of which are going to be running with full privileges, and it will break them in order for you not to do that. And some of them are going to be not playing nice with other defaults. And so it's a little bit hard to give examples, or to have a very one-size-fits-all way of here's how you attack Kubernetes, or here's how you secure Kubernetes, because it's all going to be a little bit different. So some of this is going to be kind of a lot of high-level abstractions, rather than a here is the step-by-step way to do this in this talk, because for one thing, we just don't have time to cover all of Kubernetes security in this talk. It's just too much as a topic, but I do have a resources slide at the end, and I do really recommend that you look into them, because it's a huge topic, but it's a good one, and it's an important one. And also, just because I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer, but so there's going to be a lot of here's generally the things that you need to think about in here. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So if I haven't come across fully that it's complicated yet, has anyone played with Kubernetes here at all? Did you find it complicated? Probably. I found it complicated. There was a big learning curve. As I said, there's a lot of moving parts. And that's also the reason historically for the open defaults. Because the best-selling book about Kubernetes of all time is called Kubernetes Up and Running. And the reason why it's called Kubernetes Up and Running is because it's hard to get Kubernetes up and running. It's actually just a sort of a difficult thing to have to deal with. And so historically, the defaults have been open in order to get users and developers to be able to set the thing up, do the thing that they're trying to do, and move on with their day. And that's cool. That's important to be able to do. But that also means that security has often been an afterthought, and it hasn't been on by default. And when you set your thing up, move on with your day, sometimes you also throw things in prod. Who here has ever worked on a production server? Any of you? Everybody who's ever touched production knows that what happens in production stays in production. Sometimes, it's there, you don't want to deal with a breaking change, maybe you put it there and forgot about it, like, it's out there still. And it can be really challenging for people, especially when that open default thing is already out there, to try to figure out how to secure it after the fact. For this reason, secure defaults are really important. And if you take one thing out of this talk, it's that secure defaults are really important. Make sure to set your thing up right in the first place. And yeah, security in general, it's challenging. Cloud Native Computing Foundation did this survey in fall 2017. And that said that security was the top challenge for Kubernetes users that they surveyed. It's a big deal. And this can lead to real-world consequences. Tesla, who are the cautionary tale in every security about Kubernetes talk that will ever happen forever, famously had their stuff hacked via a kubelet exploit to run crypto miners on their accounts. Weight Watchers had a wide open port that allowed control of the clusters and their resources. It didn't have a password on it at all. It had admin access. People could just wander right in and do that. Shopify recently had a $25,000 bug bounty with a really interesting attack chain that you should look up because it's super interesting, which had sort of similar principles. This stuff's everywhere. It's a problem. It's a problem for big companies full of smart people. And it's a problem for a lot of people. Even hackers aren't immune to this problem. I mentioned capture the flag games earlier. B-Sides, which is sort of like DevOps days for the security community, in San Francisco ran a CTF in 2017. And they ran their CTF on Kubernetes infrastructure. And one of the players, who presumably had more experience with Kubernetes than perhaps the people who were putting on the back end of the CTF did, went straight into the back door, took over their API server, got all of the flags, turned back around, handed the flags back to the capture the flag organizers, and were like, y'all, you need to fix your API. So hackers aren't actually immune to this either. It's complicated for everybody. This is sort of a widespread problem. In tiny font here, there is both a write-up of how they did that and also B-Sides write-up of how they fixed it. So for whatever that's worth. So I've got good news and bad news here. It is actually possible to secure your Kubernetes cluster if you have one. The bad news is it's not actually going to come that way by default, most likely. It's going to take some work on your part. And it's going to take some work on your part that isn't one time. It's, if you set it and it looks great then, and then CVEs come out later, it's not going to be okay anymore. You need to keep an eye on it, and you need to continually be analyzing your code and what's in your cluster. It's also important to know that Kubernetes security is only as secure as the host and operating system that it's on. So if your kernel is vulnerable to Meltdown or Spectre, your cluster is also vulnerable to Meltdown or Spectre, because as I said, a shared kernel equals a shared kernel attack surface. If your operating system isn't patched properly and people are able to attack that, your cluster is also going to be able to be attacked. You want to make sure that everything from the operating system, the host, the networking that you're doing, what the application code in the containers themselves, what's in your cluster, all of it is you want to make sure that you're securing all of it. You want to be doing defense in depth in layers. And unlike in development, you actually want to be repeating yourself. Dry in terms of defending is not actually a thing that you necessarily want. So you can do it, but it is going to be some work. And one thing I will say also, though, is that a lot of the public cloud providers, and by a lot, I really mostly mean GCP, but the different ones have different things that, and I don't work for Google, that they allow you to do to help with security stuff. It is actually easier in some ways to secure something that's on a public cloud if you're able to do it than it is to try to roll your own. So whatever that's worth. So one thing while you're trying to figure out what to do to secure your cluster and how to do that is figure out what your threat model is. And that's going to be your first thing that you need to do. Because without a proper threat model, you're not going to be able to make strategic decisions about what you need to defend and how you need to defend it. So things to consider about your threat model. What are you trying to protect? Literally what assets, what data are you trying to protect in those clusters, in your resources? Who are you trying to protect it from? Who are you concerned about? Are you concerned about random script kiddies? Are you concerned about people trying to target you specifically for one reason or another? Are you concerned about nation states? If you're concerned about nation states, you might be in deeper shit than your average fancy bear. What capabilities do those adversaries that you're concerned about have? What are they able to do? Are they low-skilled script kiddies? Again, are they high-skilled nation states? Like, what exactly are they able to do? What are they able to do it with? And then what capabilities do you have to defend against those things? So, consider consider your threat model, consider what makes sense. Because without doing that, then you're starting to do things like, oh, well, we're going to spend a lot of time and resources on securing against some really exotic ODA, and we're going to leave our ports open without authentication on them. I like exotic ODAs as much as the next hacker. Anyone who follows me on Twitter can confirm. They're fun to talk about, they're shiny, they're exciting, but mostly attacks don't happen because of those. Mostly attacks happen because of things like admin, or leaving your port open and not putting authentication on it. Things like that are like boring and not really exciting to talk about, but are actually still the thing that happens most of the time. So you want to make sure that you're getting your basics right. And this is important because, again, there are real-world consequences for this. If you're not getting your basics right, if you're not securing your stuff properly, this can lead to shipwrecks, and not necessarily a thing that you want to happen to you or to your org. Because here's the thing. Hackers don't give a shit. This is a poster from KiwiCon 2009, almost 10 years old, really actually holds up very well with time. Hackers don't care. It isn't their problem. In fact, if it's your problem, often that can be advantageous for attackers because it is a blocker for you, but it's not going to be a blocker for them. They're able to just go do whatever, and the more access and the more leeway you give them, the more they're going to be able to do. So don't do it. Generally speaking, hackers are going to come from different places. Every one of them is going to have different motivations. Maybe she'll use different tools, things like that. But for the most part, attackers have some things in common. For one thing, previous slide. For another thing, they have kind of similar workflows. They start out by, if it's an external attacker, kind of discovering what is on the server, like figuring out what it is that they're looking at. They, once they find it, they enumerate it by figuring out things like what services are running on here, are they being patched, is there a way to get internet access here? Can you download tools for this? Do these things already exist? That kind of thing. Once you figure out if there's some vulnerability there or a hole, you do your initial foothold, you do your exploit, you get in. Once you're in there, you kind of do the thing where you look around again, figure out where you are, what you can do from there. And also, you can do things like, is there any sensitive files in here that are interesting? Is there cloud provider metadata? Is there any kind of credentials or anything that I can steal? What can I do from here? If you are not running privileged, you could try to figure out how to escalate your privilege. You could try to figure out how to move laterally, which can happen both horizontally and vertically in a cluster context, because either you can move across the cluster from container to container, or you can move vertically to the host or to a cloud account. And then from there, you kind of do it again. Okay, well, where am I now? How far can I get? It's always a matter of trying to figure out what's there, what kind of access you get, and going as far as you can. So your mission as a defender or as an operator is to prevent that person from being able to get very far or being able to see what's going on. And there's various ways to do that. The first thing to consider is, it's been said that defenders think in lists while attackers think in graphs. You need to know what's in your graph. Do you know what's in your graph? You don't have to answer that. But that isn't necessarily a rhetorical question. It's often hard to know exactly what is in your containers, what is in your clusters, what is in things like your network or your public cloud account. Who has access to those resources? Do you give admin to everybody? You don't have to tell me if you do, but I bet somebody does. And do you do these things like who is able to access this? What are those things able to access in each other? How are your microservices communicating? Is there any kind of network segmentation preventing things that don't need to see other things from being able to see them? There's a lot to think about, and it's often, as I said, really hard to know, especially if you're working in a large enterprise context where often sheer size or process issues or bureaucracy or whatever can make it difficult to impossible to figure out for the right hand to figure out what the left hand is doing. But you want to have as much knowledge about what's happening in your clusters, in your clouds as you can, because that is going to enable you to be able to secure those resources, those assets, and it's not easy to threat model if you don't actually know what you're protecting. So consider what's in your graph. Generally speaking, the Kubernetes threat model is you're looking at external attackers, you're looking at application or container compromise, like within a cluster, or you're looking at a compromised user or credentials, and that's kind of the same thing, because computers are dumb pipes. If I have your credentials and there's no multi-factor happening, as far as the computer's concerned, I'm you. So that's both similar and a little different, but for the purposes of the dumb pipe, pretty much the same. So let's talk about that a little bit. External attackers. As I said, this is going to depend on your threat model a little bit. If you have attackers who are specifically targeting you, they're not necessarily going to be looking for you in the way that I'm about to describe. But here's how an external attacker might find a cluster. Here are some ports that are open or could be in Kubernetes clusters. This is not the entire list of what could potentially be open in a Kubernetes context, because a lot of things like Calico and Weave and Helm Tiller and different ones also use different ports that can be found. External attackers are going to be looking for these, some of which are more, 443, there's 443s everywhere, but some of which are going to be more immediately identifiable than others, to figure out where is a cluster that they can attack. And if you have these ports open to the wider internet, you should know that people are looking and they are able to find them. Who's ever heard of Showdown here? Who here has not heard of Showdown? A couple of you. Well, you're in for a treat. So Showdown is like a search engine for the internet. It allows people to find all kinds of wild things, including open ports, different kinds of devices, and things that are able to be found exposed to the wider internet from all over the world. This was a search for etcd. It's important to know that not all etcd databases are connected to Kubernetes clusters, but many of them are. That was done a little while ago. I did a more recent one. It's actually gone up since then. I had to do some work to find a screenshot that did not involve somebody's SSH keys, because there are a lot of SSH keys up there, and they're being left there in plain text. An important thing to know about etcd is that historically, all of it is in clear text. And I'll get into the Kubernetes control plane in a little bit, but etcd is basically the brains of the whole operation, and if it's in clear text, you're able to find all of the information, including all of the databases, all of the credentials, all of the everything in there. So this is a big deal. And if you're like, I'm small, we're not a target, like nobody's gonna be looking for us here, you're incorrect, because Showdown just puts out everybody who's exposed. And if you're like, well, it's only been up for a little bit, they're not gonna find it, Showdown re-indexes every 24 hours. Most of these were a few hours old by the time I got them, but not really a lot older than that. So this is a thing that can potentially affect you if you leave your ports open and exposed. So don't leave your ports open and exposed if you don't have to. If you do have to, make sure that if there is a management port that's visibly externally, that it requires authentication, which is not necessarily going to be on by default in a lot of contexts. So you want to make sure that it does, because otherwise the thing that happened to Weight Watchers can happen to you, and there will be a management port that has basically admin access to the entire cluster with no auth that just takes API calls from whoever. That's not necessarily a good place for you to be. You don't necessarily want to be there. You want to make sure to rotate your keys regularly on the off chance that something is out there. You want to make sure to only give administrative access when it's needed to. And you want to limit SSH access to Kubernetes nodes. And if you do need SSH access to anything, make sure to create an SSH bastion for those nodes, because that will prevent, brute forcing and random script kiddies and stuff from being able to do things as easily as they otherwise could. SSH is imperfect, as I think we've all seen in the last couple of weeks, but it is better to create protections around this stuff than not. It's also really important to make sure that you are handling your credentials safely, and that you are segmenting your network such that if somebody does get in there, that they're not going to be able to see everything else that's happening. Because a lot of, if you're leaving stuff open, which again is often the default, it can make it so that once you're in that cluster, you can go anywhere. So let's talk about user or credential compromise real quick. One way that you could potentially compromise a user or a set of credentials is to create something like a helpful blog post or a helpful Docker container explaining something about Kubernetes that is perhaps complex or not well understood, which to be honest, is a lot of things about Kubernetes. So let's talk about something like really complicated setup of service meshes. And this is actually the only time I'll mention service meshes in this talk, but you should look them up, they're cool. And if you don't understand them, and you're inclined to do things like copy and paste code from Stack Overflow, or run kubectl create-f, whatever script I found on the internet.yaml, this may not go well for you, because you can actually put out bad containers, bad code, and things that may put shells or malware on your cluster if you're not paying attention. So don't fall for that. And if you're a developer and you're like, I'm not a target, you should know that developers are fantastic targets. They're fantastic targets because they have access to the keys to the kingdom. Often they have access to credentials, they have access to cloud providers, they have access to different things like that. Also, developers don't think that they're targets, and they're very confident about that. Salesforce did an internal survey a little while ago that found that developers were actually more likely to click on phishing links than marketing or sales. All of us should be embarrassed about this. And if you are not a developer and you have developer friends, you should talk about that, because we don't actually want developers to be easily compromised, but it absolutely can happen, especially when they're convinced that they're not targets. So don't fall for that kind of thing. And don't consider yourself immune, because if you think you're immune, that can be a problem. Here is a lovely example of popping calp.exe golf clap. Don't build that Docker container. As far as I know, it is live. It will pop your calculator. But that does work, and that is an example of like, hey, cool, look, it's a cool tutorial. You can do this thing. Don't do that particular thing, but that can happen. And preventing credential compromise, you want to make sure that you're not committing your creds to GitHub or anywhere else that can be publicly Googled, because it is absolutely possible to do that, and people do it all the time. GitHub nowadays has a thing where they can theoretically prevent credentials from being uploaded to public repos, but there's only so many kinds of credentials that it's able to recognize, because there's so many different kinds. So you want to make sure that you and your devs are not doing that anyway. And you want to make sure that you're handling your secrets safely. HashiCorp Vault is a really good way to do that. A way to not handle your secrets safely is to base 64 encode them. That is not encryption. You also don't want to keep them in plain text environment variables, and base 64 is basically plain text, because you can just do getenv or whatever in a container context, and then I can see all of your creds, and that isn't actually really protection at all. So you want to make sure that you are using credential handlers that actually will protect them and will prevent people like me from being able to see them. And container compromise, again, there's a little bit of overlap here. Docker Hub recently took down some images that had been downloaded more than 5 million times that put crypto miners on people's machines. Don't download things and run them without knowing what they do. Really make sure to read the code, really make sure that you know what's going on, because again, that can go badly for you if you don't. Also, make sure that you're writing your code securely, that your devs are, and that you're paying attention to what's in your container. Make sure that you're using like a static and dynamic analysis of like what is in your code base, what's in your containers. Make sure that the dependencies that you're using, whether open source or otherwise, are also using code that does not contain vulnerabilities. And you're going to want to do this more than once, because if you did all of those things and it looked great 6 months ago and 24 CVEs have come out since then, it's not going to look great anymore. So it's not a thing you can do once and then leave alone. It's a thing you want to kind of continually stay on top of. And again, know your assets, know what's in your containers, what's in your clusters, and try to keep them as clean as possible. There are open source tools for some of this, like Claire by CoreOS, and some really good third-party services. I also don't work for Aqua. Aqua's pretty great. There are other companies like Twistlock and Encapsulate that do this stuff. Look into what makes sense for your use case. And you can do those things yourself too. But again, make sure to do them and make sure to stay on top of them. And if you do find something vulnerable, don't just leave it there. Make sure to patch or make sure to mitigate it, because otherwise it's just hanging out there. And one thing about containers being immutable is that on the one hand, you can, if it's acting funny, if something's going wrong, you can destroy it, you can create another one. Cool. But if it has malware on it, and that's why it's acting badly, and the malware lives on your container registry, you're just going to have zombie malware that is going to continually come back up every time you destroy that container and recreate it. One thing to know about container registries is that write access is often on by default. And it doesn't necessarily have to be. So if you don't need your devs or yourself to have write access to the container registry, you should probably turn that off, because it makes it very easy for me to do something like persistence, although containers theoretically are not designed for persistence, by putting my reverse shell back up in your container registry with my write access, and then you just continually have it until somebody puts something else there. So keep an eye on your registries, maybe turn that write access off. Here's the Kubernetes control plane, just explaining some sort of like parts and like things to keep an eye out for in terms of both attacking and defending. Kubernetes is made of like master nodes and worker nodes. kubectl is the kind of CLI tool that allows you to control Kubernetes. It doesn't necessarily come natively in a cluster, but it will be, as an attacker, one of the first things I'm going to look for when I get in there, because it allows me to control it. The API server is going to be the best goal for attackers, because it communicates with kubectl, it communicates with the worker nodes, and particularly the kubelets, which are sort of like the controller of what happens in every individual worker node. The kubelet talks to the containers, kind of manages things, does all the things. It also talks to etcd. I mentioned etcd before. etcd is a key value store that contains all of the information about what's happening in those clusters, including the databases, the credentials. Every piece of information that's in there is just going to be stored as key value in there. Again, historically it's plain text. It's not anymore, but you're going to want to check your etcd version to make sure that it's not. And you do want to make sure that that is going to be encrypted, and that communication between these moving parts is going to be authenticated, because otherwise it just allows people to go wherever. There's different ways to do this that I'll be talking about in a minute, but you want to make sure your network is segmented. Things aren't able to talk to one another that don't have to. You're not able to access privileged resources as a non-privileged user, and that you're not running it privileged at all, actually, because one thing about Linux and the way that it treats namespaces is that in Linux everything is a file, right? Everything is kind of set up that way on both the host system as well as in a cluster context. And so if you're running a container as privileged, and for example, you're mounting it into a host, there was a very nasty pair of CVEs that came out about this some time ago. Kubernetes has since patched for this, but again, older versions still exist in the wild, called subpath host mount. And that meant that if you had it mounted, if you had a privileged container mounted on the host, you actually just had read-write root access from the container, from the cluster to the host, which is super exciting if you're an attacker. Again, is maybe not going to lead to a good day for you if you're a deployment, or if you're trying to deploy or defend it. So that is a thing to keep an eye out for. And you want to just kind of limit your attack surface. You want to limit your blast radius. Make sure that people can't get any farther than they absolutely have to, and aren't able to access anything that they don't have to. Again, with privileged, don't run your containers as root. It's just not smart. There are certain services, Helm in particular, and Helm Tiller attached to it are sort of notorious for this, but kops and some other sort of commonly used installers and managers of Kubernetes are also sort of guilty of this. They run with full privs. You can't run them without breaking it. And because they are allowed to run in the way that they do, and they're allowed to manage clusters, they can go right around things like pod security policies. So if you're using Helm, Tiller, kops, things like that, you want to make sure that you are configuring it such that you're being especially careful about segmentation. So pod security policies can prevent certain kinds of privesc. Literally, you can set allow privilege escalation false in the YAML. That is a real thing. You can look it up, but not right now. And that will prevent people from being able to escalate privilege. It will also break some things because of the ways that privilege is dealt with in a container context. It's since been sort of replaced by something called deny escalating exec, which has its sort of own problematic elements. But pod security policies, you can do a lot with them. They're going to be really important for that. In preventing lateral movement, you can prevent different parts of the cluster from being able to access other ones, both in terms of what it's able to see and what it's able to move to. Again, limit communication to only where it really needs to be. Think about it like a need-to-know basis. Because if you don't do that, container breakouts can happen. And that's not just your container. That's not just your cluster. That is your cloud account. That is your internal networks. That is whatever it is that you're trying to protect. This stuff's important. And so getting your basics right, practicing your good cyber hygiene is really going to help a lot. I have a bullet-pointed list here, and every single one of these is more than an hour-long talk. Again, complexity, moving parts, but all of these are really important, and all of those are going to be important if you are securing your own clusters. So take a picture of that if you want to, and you should Google all of those, because all of them are going to be things that you're going to need to know about to control the cluster. I've tried to figure out how to give this talk while explaining those and giving them any kind of justice. I've not figured out how to do it yet. Anyone has an idea how to do that, I would love to hear about it. So look those up. Those are going to be really important for controlling the different moving pieces and making sure that you have as much defense in depth happening as possible. And again, defense in depth. Reduce your attack surface. Make it so that I have as few ways to get in as possible, and that I can, and limit your blast radius. If I'm in there, make sure I can't get any farther than I possibly am able to, and prevent people from being able to get in, prevent people from being able to do as much damage as possible, and that's going to make a lot of difference in terms of protecting yourself against people who are trying to attack you in a Kubernetes context. Principle of least privilege. Again, need to know basis. I keep saying this stuff, and it's kind of boring. Like, we've all heard it before. It's like, oh my god, that's like every security talk ever. Like, IPtables rules? Like, really? Like, we're going old school with this? Actually, IPtables rules are really important for network segmentation, so not even kidding here. But the reason why we keep saying this stuff over and over is because it's important. And the thing is that, as far as I can tell, computer security has not actually been achieved. And one of the reasons why it hasn't been achieved yet is because people aren't getting these basics correct. So get your basics correct. That is actually, going to take you a really long way in terms of securing your Kubernetes clusters. And yeah. General recommendations. If you can update your Kubernetes versions, you should really do that. I understand that breaking changes happen, and again, in enterprise contexts, these things can be complicated for other reasons. But if you're running anything below 1.6, there is no multi-user support. There is only one user. That user is admin. And there is no role-based access control. There is no segmentation. Everything is absolutely wide open. Anybody who calls into that API, because Kubernetes is API-based, is just actually able to have root access to the cluster. Kubernetes 1.6 came out a year and a half ago. Kubernetes hasn't been around that long, and again, this rate of change is really rapid. So a lot of the time, people are running 1.6, 1.7 in prod, and that's better than 1.5. But really, the good security features didn't start coming out until 1.8, 1.9, and that was pretty recently. Some of them, in kind of the classical attack surface of what that has historically looked like, didn't get deprecated until 1.12, or will be deprecated in 1.13. 1.12 came out 2 weeks ago. This is happening in real time. So update to as high a version as you can. If you can't update, which again, I understand it happens, make sure to mitigate those problems by configuring your cluster to be as locked down as you can make it, while also making your cluster work. And secure defaults, especially if you're not running Kubernetes in production already, are going to be super important. Again, if you take one thing out, take that out, because if you set it up right the first time, again, you're not necessarily going to be able to just leave it there, but you're going to have a much easier time doing that than when your developers are already on top of it, depending on ports being open for their workflow, and then are going to be mad at you if you're trying to secure it by closing it. If you have it be secure in the first place by default, that's going to be less of an issue for you. Be careful with your secrets. Again, you don't want to leave them in plain text. Historically, that might be the case. So, make sure to put off on your stuff. Make sure to encrypt your data in traffic and at rest. Make sure to put quotas on your resources, both for the purposes of preventing things like crypto miners and also for your own sanity, because the way that Kubernetes auto-scales, if you don't put any kinds of quota on your resources, you will DDoS yourself. It will make your day sad. So make sure to do that. And you want to log and monitor. Observability, we're DevOps people, is really important. You want to know what's happening in there. But the thing about this is you want to log and monitor outside of your cluster. Either have it being transported out of there or being doubled out of there, because if I'm in this cluster that I've already compromised and your only source of truth is the logs within that cluster, I'm just going to tamper with those logs. You're never going to know that I've been there, and that will be unfortunate. So you want to make sure that you're doubling those resources so that even if somebody does tamper with those logs, you're able to find an actual source of truth, relatively speaking. Again, a lot of this is standard security advice. Least privilege, defense in depth, like keep communication to only where it needs to be. But again, it's really important. Get your basics right. It's going to be huge. And you got this. You can do it. I believe in you. Here's your resource slide. You should take a picture of it. All of these resources are fantastic. Some of them are going to be pretty serious rabbit holes. The CIS benchmarks for Kubernetes are a 250-page PDF, I believe, is the most recent version. Some of these are link dumps, which are going to have more rabbit holes attached to them. But a lot of, it's really important to know how to do this well. And these resources will really help you a lot in figuring out how to do that. One thing to figure out about the benchmarks also is that you don't actually necessarily want 100% score, because if you have 100% score on the CIS benchmarks, your cluster actually will fail. It won't work because you've logged it down. You've locked it down so much that it actually just can't function. So you want to make sure to use those as a guideline and do the things that make sense for your use case to the extent that you can. Wait, nope, I'm going back. Or something. Nope, going back there. Whee! And there's the resource slide. I'll leave it up. If anybody has any questions, I can take them. Thank you, everybody.